Hi everyone, and welcome to the Security Magazine video podcast sponsored by Cyjax. I'm Ian Thornton-Trump. Today, as usual, Lisa Forte and Philip Ingram. Say hello, guys.
Hello, guys.
Oh,
Yes, we could have rehearsed that.
Unscripted, but there are some things that we're going to talk about today. So we're in the wake of quite an international story with implications kind of on cyber and whatnot. But before we get to that, we've asked Lisa to set the tone of our discussion today a little bit because it's a passionate subject. The pager explosions followed by the walkie-talkie explosions in the Middle East country of Lebanon, allegedly focused on Hezbollah. But as Lisa pointed out in our pre-show conference, there's a lot of aspects to this that we should probably frame up first.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Over to you.
So I think the key thing to remember in a lot of this is that at the moment details are pretty lacking, right? And there's a lot of theories that are being put out, but not just put out as sort of healthy discussion, which I think is what we had before we started filming today, but putting out as like conclusive, it was a war crime, it wasn't a war crime, it was this, it violated that, it didn't violate this. Well, actually we don't know, because actually technically at the time that we're recording this, we don't actually have someone who said it was us. Yep. So we don't even know that for an absolute fact. We can hypothesize with
which
some
we will
degree,
probably do.
Almost certainly. And to be fair, I think there's, it's probably pointing in one direction, but we don't know. And I think we've got to be very careful of what we say with certainty and what we say as discussion, as healthy discussion to talk about the potential issues. And we've seen this with the fact that it was initially talked about being a cyber attack exploiting a zero-day. We now know that came from Hezbollah as misinformation, essentially, that spread around. But again, that had profound consequences when it started to spread around the media. We've got to be really careful. People talking about how it was the lithium batteries. Well, there are people who are saying, well, that's looking pretty unlikely because they tend to burn, they don't tend to explode, etc., etc. So again, we have to be really careful and we have to frame this as we're discussing the facts as we know it, pros, cons, from a fairly neutral perspective on this, as much as we can try to be neutral. Because we just don't know. And I think that's really important to preface everything.
And therefore, the comments that we're bringing in are from a theoretical perspective, from how we would assess that these things
could
have been
happen.
planned and could happen based on our experience. Doesn't mean that is exactly how it happened.
Exactly.
And therefore, that caveat is very pertinent indeed.
So in the early stages, as the story developed, we had two camps. And I've never seen the information security community so divided in the discussions, because the discussion was, can we remote detonate these common everyday items, with a quote cyber attack? There were folks that tried to push the narrative forward that this indeed was now, the physical meets cyber attack, manifesting, but it quickly emerged to be a story about a counterterrorism operation due to its focus on the leadership of Hezbollah. From your perspective, Phil, you being quite the expert on counterterrorism, how audacious and how out of the box thinking, pun intended, was this operation?
Extremely audacious, and it's something that will have taken a long time to plan. And I'm glad that the disinformation, as you mentioned, that came out about the cyber attack causing the batteries on devices to overheat and then explode was stopped very quickly indeed, because just think of the implications for global travel with mobile devices. I think if that had been proven, or if it had been allowed to run any longer, we'd have seen airlines across the world grounding everything until they found a way of securing mobile devies in the air.
It took one set of Nikes to make us take our shoes off every time we were going to or from America. For 10 years, I think that policy was in effect.
Exactly, and the liquid bombs, the underpants bombs, and all the rest of it. So we can see how this can have an effect, and this is where disinformation getting out, and your caveat at the very beginning, we have to be careful what we speculate about, is so important. So you using that from a framing perspective. Looking at all of the information that we've got in the public domain, this was almost certainly what's called a supply chain attack. Now, supply chain attacks are unusual but they have happened before. They've happened in the cyber world. There have been examples reported in the press where routers have left their factory. They've gone into the logistics chain. That logistics chain has dropped them off at another address where other components have been added into the routers. They've been put back out into the logistics chain without anyone knowing and go off to the customer. Those other components are used to exploit the access that the routers got.
Sure, that actually has a bigger picture story and is quite possibly one of the reasons why Kaspersky, the company, is no longer welcome in the United States.
And you find that with software that's put around the place. So that's in there. And the use of a nation state here, and I'm not accusing any nation state of getting involved in this.
I know you're being very careful.
I'm being very careful indeed. But the use of nation states in warfare, using irregular tactics to cause a military effect. Because you go back to the Second World War, because back in the history the whole way through, people have looked at different ways of doing things. But if we go back to the SOE operations during the Second World War, we saw big lumps of coal with explosives put in them, which could be put in areas, railway areas and other bits and pieces to cause explosions and cause disruption. We saw rats with explosive devices put in them and been able to be left in places that they could have an effect where you had they were dead whenever the explosives were put in. If not, they were dead after the explosives had been put in. But they were then used against what was classed as legitimate military targets as part of a declared war. And warfare was going on. We then get into the game of where we see inanimate everyday objects being deliberately booby-trapped and led in places where they could be picked up by anyone. Now there's a difference. If you've got an exploding rat and you've put that underneath a railway line, so someone's walking past it, just goes, that's a dead rat, doesn't go, that's an explosive to damage the railway line, then you've had a military assessment as to the effect you're going to achieve, what's likely to be there, because you'll have looked at the patterns of patrols and everything else, and what the potential for collateral damage is. Whereas if you put a booby trap out in a child's toy or something, well, you're actually targeting anyone that's going to pick it up, and potentially children. There's a huge difference in that. Yeah. And this is where whoever carried out the assessment into the attack that happened against Hezbollah will have had a massive operation observing what Hezbollah's behavior is beforehand, looking at how they will communicate, their backup communications and everything else, and then how they can influence that, and then watching their supply chain and looking at how they order electronic devices, where those electronic devices go through, where you can intercept that supply chain, whether that's you manufacture them and put them in yourself under license, or you intercept them manufactured elsewhere, we don't know. The distribution of those devices then whenever they get in. And then what their fallback devices would be once that operation has gone off, and we saw the fallback devices being the two-way radios that exploded 24 hours after the pagers.
Lisa, this was sort of, I think you mentioned things like gray area, kind of off the charts. International humanitarian law is a bit specific and non-specific in this particular case. What are your thoughts on where we're sitting right now based on the information we have at hand?
Well, I think there's a couple of complicating factors here. And again, this comes back to the fact we simply just don't know yet. No one's even taken responsibility for it, let alone started to have any sort of open and frank discussion over what risk assessment was conducted, if any. We're assuming there was, we're assuming a lot of things, but again, we're even potentially assuming who it was, which it may not even be.
Until we know, we don't know what procedures to apply. So anything that we talk about are theoretical procedures 100%. That we would expect to be applied.
I think as an attack, in some ways it wasn't that novel, really, because in 1996, as we talked about before, the chief bomb maker of Hamas, he had his mobile phone blown up for explosives. I think also in 2008, there was a Hezbollah military commander who had his brand new SUV had explosives planted in it and it was blown up as well. So I mean, this isn't massively novel as a concept, is it? There are UN treaties prohibiting booby traps and things like that in what they call harmless objects, or objects that someone would perceive to be harmless. which potentially you could deduce a pager and a walkie-talkie would fall into that category. But there are other tests as well, which maybe this does or does not pass. We'll have to wait and see. It will be interesting to see if it is brought in front of the Security Council, and if so, I think what will be very interesting from my perspective will be to see how the veto members vote on anything that goes through that, because we've got an interesting collection of people who are veto members in the Security Council, some of whom I think we can guess which direction they'll vote in already.
Well, I'm reminded in World War II of the infamous, and then later on this has been adopted in the Ukrainian and Russian wars, of wiring up a toilet with a satchel charge. Because if there's one thing soldiers like in the field, it's porcelain. So you're right about the harmless object, but the counter argument to that was that it seemed that the Israelis targeted the Hamas leadership. The majority of pagers blowing up tended to go towards people that had gotten the Hamas pager or the Hezbollah pager.
That's correct, but it's not just limited to the actual target. International humanitarian law extends
collateral damage.
100%. And the assessment of that at the moment is patchy, and we're relying on information coming out of Lebanon, which we're not entirely sure how accurate that is. And we're also we also don't actually have any insight as to what was done in the planning stages and what this looked at, and that does make a huge difference.
But,
right, Phil?
well, it is, but there's a few things that we can look at from the theoretical perspective here, and it's identifying whether the targets were the targets themselves were legitimate. So you've got necessity and proportionality are the two bits that lead into everything. So was it necessary for Hezbollah to be targeted? Were they members of a military? Was that military carrying out attacks against third parties?
Demonstrably they were.
And everything else. So yes, they were. If a military uses an inanimate object, a civilian object, an object that you'd normally expect to be safe for military purposes, that is deemed a military object. So if you use a civilian ambulance to move arms around the front line, that civilian ambulance loses all of its protection under international humanitarian law, and it can be targeted because it's being used as a military target. So were the targets legitimate? Yes. Proportionality then comes into it. And if you have decided that the military effect that you need to have is to degrade the military capability of your enemy, you have got a number of choices of doing it. You can shoot them, you can use the booby-trapped pagers and other novel devices. You can identify where they live and drop a missile, whether it be a precision-guided missile, some of which can be designed just to kill people that are in that room, but it'll do anyone that's in that room, or a bomb that will destroy the building or anything else, which is what we've seen used across the Middle East. When you're coming into the proportionality and therefore the potential for collateral damage and your collateral damage assessment, which is key to this, something that's targeted that will be a very small explosive that may have an effect on people that are in the immediate vicinity, but you've got that effect tied in as much as possible, is more proportional than dropping a 500-pound bomb onto an apartment to have an effect.
It's difficult because when reading the commentary that's come out of the United Nations human rights community, actually one of the concerns is, and again this is a big question mark because we don't know, is could whoever did this, whichever nation state was behind this attack, could they tell with reasonable certainty where these targets were and exactly where they were before they detonated those pages? And I think that will be the question, and we can't answer that question.
And would your country, whichever country it is, even respond to that?
Well,
are they under any obligation?
They almost certainly won't. Well, they'll be under obligation if they're taken to International Criminal Court and have to try and prove things there. But you don't always get into that. And a lot of what comes out of the United Nations from a humanitarian perspective is very wishy-washy and very anti-anything going bang, and therefore anyone that uses anything in warfare is automatically contravening something from someone's opinion that gets published. I've yet to see something that is properly balanced coming out of them.
And anyone that does bang for a living, obviously, is going to go through their process.
You don't have to assess where the individuals will be. You will have observed that in a pattern of life over a period of time. And of course, we saw al-Nusra, the leader of Hezbollah, turning around and saying to all the Hezbollah members not to use their mobile phones because they were being tracked by the Israelis. So over a period of time, the Israelis would have been able to heat map, if it was the Israelis behind it, or any nation state with that ability, heat map where those telephones had been. So they can build up an identity of them.
Sure.
But can you guarantee where that mobile device is going to be at that particular time on a particular day? You can't. You can't. So what you would be doing then is, in your intelligence assessments, looking at who is going to have this device with the explosive in it, and the assessment, if I was doing it, would be: can we guarantee to a reasonable degree, to an acceptable degree, and that acceptable degree is decided by the lawyers, the commanders, and the politicians, that it's going to be those of them who are military individuals first and foremost. And then can we design the device that's in there to make sure that it has an effect on the person that is holding it or has it in their pocket or something else, and reduces the effect for those that are surrounding. Now, is that going to eliminate every other person from being a casualty? No. But a lot of the videos that we saw around the place, there was a guy standing beside a teller in a shop buying things. When we saw him fall to the floor, the shop teller was still there standing, and the people in front of him and the people behind him. Yeah. When we saw someone in a fruit market falling down to the ground after the explosion had happened, all of those around the fruit stall were still standing around him. So that suggests that whoever designed this designed it for an effect to be on the individual and close to the individual who had the device, rather than being something that would just get as many people in an area as possible just to make sure.
Right, like the indiscriminate nature of a car bomb in a marketplace.
Yeah, exactly.
There was another story that happened on an entirely different war front in Ukraine and in Russia, which, because we're going to try and keep this debate elevated and focus on what we know and what we don't know. We know that in the Geneva Convention, the use of flamethrowers was banned. But yet we saw a drone dropping thermite on Russian positions, which now the Russians have also adopted and are dropping thermite. It's a fire weapon. Is there nuance to this? I mean, we decided that these types of weapons were supposed to be outlawed, but now we're seeing them on the battlefield. Is there a certain sense that, you're going to do whatever is necessary to defeat the enemy?
I think there's also an element of international. So international law is a very complicated area of law. So it's partly sort of codified, so it's written in charters and regulations, black letter law, but it also has this slightly abnormal component to it, which is called customary international law, which is set by custom. So, for example, back in the days of Somali piracy, the UN took a really unprecedented decision, which was to allow foreign navies into Somali territorial waters and then onto the land of Somalia in order to suppress the piracy threat, which was incredibly, that just doesn't happen, right? But in order to get around this issue that we have in international law of customary international law, they explicitly said this does not create customary international law, i.e., because we've permitted it this one time, it does not mean you can now go and do this anywhere in the world. And this is the problem that you have in international law. When the international community allows something to take place, it creates a custom almost that can then be used again. And I guess, coming back to the Lebanon attacks, this kind of feeds into that, right? Yeah. If it's permitted, right, and this is it's a very difficult argument. All of it is very difficult. If you're saying, yeah, that's fine, that's legitimate, then you're saying that's fine, that's legitimate, right, to everybody.
Yeah.
Is that okay, or is that not okay? And that's quite difficult.
And then we have the slippery slope argument too, right?
But when we get into the fire weapons and bits and pieces, in the same way that there's been the argument around cluster munitions and everything else, I'm not sure what the international convention is that's restricting the use of fire-based weapons, and whether Russia, Ukraine, and other countries have signed up to it. If we look at cluster munitions, we know that Ukraine and Russia have not signed up to the Convention on Cluster Munitions. Neither has the United States, which is why the United States could supply them. And a lot of the countries that did sign up to the
Conventions,
on cluster munitions are now sitting back and going, oh, we've seen the nature of warfare change.
Yeah.
Do we need to withdraw from those conventions? Now, there are other exact conventions that...
well, the anti-landmine treaty.
Well, the anti-landmine treaties, but again, that's being ignored in Ukraine by both sides.
Pretty much.
And also, the chemical weapons conventions. The use of irritant agents on the battlefield is illegal under chemical weapons conventions. The Russians are using irritants on the battlefield on Ukrainian positions before they then attack.
Well, Assad has actually used chemical weapons on people, and there hasn't been, really, he hasn't been held accountable for any of that.
And this is where there isn't an international police force that, as soon as someone is considered to over the line, then the police force goes around, knocks on the door and says, come with me, we're going to take you to court. It's, as Lisa said, much more complicated than getting people in through the International Criminal Court in The Hague. But International Criminal Court, the United States does not recognise it, and other countries don't recognise it. So there isn't one court for the whole world. If the closest that comes to it would be a stiff letter coming out of the Security Council of the United Nations condemning something, but then the Security Council of the United Nations, each of the permanent members has got a veto,
and it's polarized. Yeah,
exactly.
Absolutely.
So your international law is fantastic in theory, but in practice is virtually unenforceable.
And it's interesting because if you're on the losing side of a conflict like Bosnia-Herzegovina, the Serbians are being held accountable for their actions, but I'm going to say I don't think to date have arrested any Croatians who are probably arguably also very not good.
There were Croatians arrested after the Kosovo War. There were Kosovo Albanians arrested. One I know in particular has been arrested twice and taken to The Hague twice. His case has collapsed on both occasions because none of the witnesses could be found. But these sorts of things happen. Very inconvenient.
So one of the reasons why this is sort of like a reunion show, actually, in a lot of ways, is we took about 2 months off on hiatus, and Lisa traveled the world. Well, not the entire world, but a huge chunk of that.
98.2457%.
Yeah, she covered a lot of ground. So now she is
spreading my propaganda.
Triple platinum with the airlines, and is given the VIP treatment. Tell us a little quickly about the countries you went to and your observations, especially around the disinformation and misinformation that's out there.
Yeah, so I went to Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, the UAE, Oman, and then Malta in 2.5 months, 3 months.
Yeah, about 2 months.
It was a strange trip. Anyway, so I've been to Kazakhstan a number of times. Kazakhstan's really interesting as a country. It's pretty anti-Russian, very pro-European. I wouldn't say hugely pro the United States, but then a lot of places aren't these days for reasons. So I would say, but it's very pro-Europe, and they've actually developed quite close ties with a lot of European countries, including the United Kingdom. Uzbekistan was different though. So Uzbekistan I hadn't really researched. In true Lisa style, I'd gone, I'm in Kazakhstan, where else could I go without a visa? Oh, Uzbekistan, cool. There's a reason people don't travel to Uzbekistan in summer. It's 48 degrees and basically borders Afghanistan, so essentially it's an interesting place. I traveled basically the entirety of Uzbekistan, and what was really interesting, there's 2 things that were really interesting that I've never encountered before. The first one was that the Uzbeks, by and large, and obviously this is a sweeping generalization, but by and large the people I met, very pro-Trump. Which was the first time I've met a nation of people who think he is amazing, which was quite unusual. They're also very pro-Russia, to the extent that in certain areas they're actually quite keen on having Russia actually take control of Uzbekistan back, which was a narrative I just wasn't familiar with.
Trump-Russian link?
I know, it's novel, isn't it? We've never had that before.
Breaking news here on this. So maybe explain why they have an adoration for Trump.
So actually, when you dig into it, the reason for it was Trump removed the sanctions that had been placed on Uzbekistan, and so they saw this as brilliant. I mean, undoubtedly it is brilliant. This is the whole purpose of sanctions. It ends up becoming a real problem for the country, right? So when you remove them, it's a great moment for them, undoubtedly. The other really interesting side to Uzbekistan is it actually has, so along the southern border, it has a border with Afghanistan and then a border with Turkmenistan. And obviously, I know a bit about Turkmenistan, as I'm sure we all do. What's his name? Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov, I think, is he's commander-in-chief of Turkmenistan. And I know
crazy.
There's aspects to him that are, I mean, there's a John Oliver episode on him. If you haven't watched it, it's the best thing you'll ever watch.
Yeah.
It really sets the scene. But what was quite interesting was the Uzbeks had this like real fear of Turkmenistan, not from like a military invading capability, but like I was sort of saying naively as a European, oh, have you been to Turkmenistan? It's right there. Why would you not have been? I'd have gone. And they're like, no, I wouldn't go there. No, I wouldn't go there. No, because you can't do this and you can't say that. Yeah. And if I call my friend in Turkmenistan and I say there's something great going on in Uzbekistan, in Tashkent, then they put the phone down immediately because they're worried someone's going to come to their house. And I was just like, it was interesting because I was totally unaware of just how oppressive it was. Yeah. You know a little bit from what we read, but it's stripped from the emotion because you aren't seeing this abject fear in people of this state. And I was thinking about it, and obviously I've travelled to Mongolia. I know my travel history is
colourful.
UK Border Force are looking into it, but anyway. And the Mongolians, again, we had some really interesting things that came out of that in the previous episode that we did. And I've sort of travelled around a bit, and one of the things that's really struck me about disinformation, actually, is that often the education that people are given within a country has emanated from the government in some capacity, which in itself is laced with propaganda or bias, right?
Right.
So your knowledge of how to spot propaganda is, in turn of itself, propaganda. So it's almost like, I sort of almost feel that you have to completely remove governments from the discussion on how we handle disinformation, because inevitably it becomes disinformation.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we see that in our politics in the West. You know, government ministers come out with sound bites that meet the message they want to put across. It doesn't give the whole truth.
Yeah.
And then when we look at our newspaper reporting and everything else, you've got a headline in there, and you know, the headline, a lot of people will read the headline in the paper and go, right, that has to be accurate. Will not read the story underneath. That puts the headline into context.
Yeah, 100%.
And creates both sides of the argument.
But it's shareable. It's super shareable.
Exactly.
Super.
And this is where mobile devices are, you know, one of the biggest banes of the modern world.
Well, it's so easy to like, share, and content. And you know, I do have to say one of the most blatant examples of this is the recent press around Keir Starmer and him declaring all of the freebie things that he's gotten, all of the stuff. And to be fair, as a prime minister in a country, that's going to happen. Now, sometimes it's justifiable and sometimes it's not, but at least he's saying, you know, these are the things that I've gotten for free. They had always been there, and so it's now creative to say, oh, look, I'm being transparent, here's all the stuff that I'm getting, versus I'm not going to report all of the stuff that I'm getting. Everybody's getting stuff. That's the thing. Yeah, you know,
there is, but there's slightly more to it. When his wife got the stuff, only whenever it got called out in the press did he then say, I made an error in my declaration. And actually, it comes into this necessity and proportionality. You know, but put necessity, does it happen to virtually every politician? Yes, it does to some degree. But proportionality, actually, he's taken significantly more than any other prime minister and any other minister.
But again, that's been reported.
That's been properly declared at a time when he's talking austerity for everyone else. So does it pass the sniff test? It may be legal, but does it pass the sniff test of being moral? That's where people are getting angry about it.
It's a bit like, can I just say one other thing? So I flew from Tashkent, which is the capital of Uzbekistan, to an area called Nukus, which is basically in the far left of the country, by the Aral Sea, which is no longer a sea because they destroyed it. But anyway, that's by the by. Anyway, so when we were sort of there and like you were talking to these people about like the government and stuff in Uzbekistan, it was really interesting because again, like you said, it's like they have an atrocious human rights record, Uzbekistan, like really atrocious. And the way they fix this is by hiding the prisons in the deserts. And they're like, there's a prison over there, right over there. And I'm like, why is it, there's no road to it, there's no anything. And they're just like, I'm like, I think they fixed the human rights record by hiding
the human
rights. Like, I don't, and it's kind of the same thing, right? Like, it's getting around a rule by kind of pretending that it's not there.
And you know, as soon as someone is compromised, what you see everywhere, and it happens in Western politics as it goes elsewhere, is the disinformation bomb comes out. Someone pulls a pin out of it, throws it in there, going, right, we'll get people going off, and in every different angle, they'll miss the nub of the story, and hopefully it'll go away, because another story will bubble up tomorrow.
All right, so I'm going to end this with the one loaded question that I'm sure all of our readers are dying to know. There's a Canadian election coming up. Does anyone care in the world at all other than Canada?
Where's Canada?
Canada, there was this funny, I'm not going to say the funny joke. I'm not going to say the funny joke.
No, all right. But no, from an international perspective, is countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the sort of the Commonwealth of Nations, do they have a role?
Yeah, I think when we look at them from a geographical perspective, they're very important, and I think in the world are going to become more and more important. You look at Canada's access up to the northern Arctic routes, and as we get greater and greater global warming and the melting of the ice caps, that's going to become a greater trade route, and therefore Canada's importance in international trade routes and security for international trade routes is going to grow enormously.
And Australia is befriending China again.
Yeah, they're trying to get
and with both of them, with the land,
better deal.
With the land masses that are in there and the natural resources that exist in both countries, purely because of the geographical size that they're there, they've got. And they will have an increasing importance in the future. So whilst we sit and smile at Canada and the politics and everything else, I think it's going to become increasingly important what is going on in Canada and elsewhere over the coming years.
I also think there is a now inescapable shift east in terms of power.
Yeah.
And that's not just China, but I think that's where we're going to see the shift in power. So I do actually think Australia and Canada might play more of a role if the United States isn't positioned as world leader, as unfortunately now seems to be a done
in a tight race, is what they're saying. I'm not necessarily sure that it's as tight as we think it is, but for, shall we say, propaganda purposes, that seems to be the lay of the land. Well, that's our sort of extended episode, I guess. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Phil. I'm Ian Thornton Trump for Security Magazine's video podcast, sponsored by Cyjax.